Jake Miller leaned against the moving truck, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed his new neighborhood. Rows of tightly packed houses lined the street, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the beige monotony of his old suburban town. The sounds of the neighborhood were different too. Languages he didn't understand, kids laughing, and the distant beat of music that carried a rhythm he couldn't place. This wasn't home yet, but he had hoped it could be. After his divorce, Jake needed a fresh start. The multicultural neighborhood offered affordable rent and a sense of vibrancy that had felt promising. It was supposed to be a place where he could begin again. But now, standing in the street, he felt the weight of uncertainty settle over him. "Hey, new guy," a voice called out, jolting him from his thoughts. Jake turned to see a group of teenagers loitering on the corner, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. "Welcome to the neighborhood, white boy," one of them shouted, laughing. The others joined in, their laughter echoing in Jake's ears as his face flushed. Jake forced a smile, unsure how to respond. He wasn't naive. He knew moving into a predominantly non-white neighborhood might come with some challenges, but the comment stung, not because of its words alone, but because of the underlying tone of dismissal. Later that evening, as Jake unpacked boxes in his small kitchen, he replayed the moment in his head. Was it just a joke? Was he overreacting? Or was it a sign of things to come? He had grown up in a town where everyone looked like him, and the idea of being the outsider was unfamiliar territory. Over the next few weeks, Jake began to notice other subtle signs that he wasn't blending in. Neighbors avoided eye contact, shopkeepers were curt, and he overheard whispered remarks about gentrifiers when he walked past groups on the street. Each interaction chipped away at the excitement he had felt about moving here. One day, while standing in line at the corner store, Jake overheard someone mutter, "What's he doing here? Doesn't he have his own neighborhoods?" The words hit harder than he expected. That night, as he lay in bed, Jake stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the same question over and over. Am I really the problem? Or is it just because I'm white? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and for the first time since moving, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The morning sun cast long shadows across the narrow street as Jake stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper. His breath hitched slightly when he noticed a neighbor, an older man with salt and pepper hair, staring at him from across the road. Jake raised a hand in a tentative wave, but the man simply turned and walked back into his house, the door clicking shut behind him. It wasn't the first time Jake had felt this tension. In the weeks since moving, interactions with his neighbors had been strained, if they happened at all. Most people avoided eye contact or offered tight, polite smiles before quickly moving on. Jake couldn't help but feel the underlying current of mistrust in every interaction. Feeling like an outsider. Jake's attempts to connect with the neighborhood had been met with limited success. He visited the corner store often, hoping familiarity might breed friendliness. But the cashier, a wiry young man named Malik, barely acknowledged him beyond gruffly announcing the total. One afternoon, Jake ventured into a nearby park. He noticed clusters of families and friends occupying picnic tables, their voices mingling in a symphony of languages. He smiled at a group of kids playing soccer and offered a friendly, "Nice shot," when one of them scored a goal. The boy glanced at him briefly before running back to his friends, ignoring Jake completely. Nearby parents threw him wary glances, their conversations lowering to murmurs. Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment. Later that night, he confided in his sister during a phone call. "I don't get it, Rachel. I'm trying to be friendly, but it's like I'm invisible, or worse, like I don't belong here at all." Rachel hesitated before responding. "Jake, you're in a completely different environment than what you're used to. Maybe they're just cautious. People have their reasons, you know. You might need to give it more time." Jake sighed. "I know, it's just, I've been called things I never expected to hear. It's like no one sees me as a person, just as a stereotype." The breaking point. Things came to a head one evening when Jake attended a community meeting at the local recreation center. He thought it might be a good opportunity to get involved and show he cared about the neighborhood. The meeting started amicably enough, with discussions about parking issues and park maintenance. But tension arose when the topic of rising rents and gentrification was brought up. "This neighborhood used to be ours," one man said loudly, pointing a finger in Jake's direction. "But now, people like him move in, and suddenly we can't afford to live here anymore." Jake felt the heat of dozens of eyes on him. "I'm just renting," he said defensively. I'm not driving up the prices. I'm struggling like everyone else. Doesn't matter, another voice called out. You don't know what it's like for us. You think you can just walk in here and act like you belong? Jake's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. I moved here because I needed an affordable place to live, just like anyone else, he shot back. I'm not trying to take anything from anyone. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Jake could see the skepticism in their faces. He left the meeting feeling humiliated and angrier than ever. A chance encounter. The next day, Jake was sitting on his stoop, sipping a cup of coffee and replaying the events of the meeting in his mind, when a voice broke his thoughts. You look like you could use a friend. Jake glanced up to see an older woman standing on the sidewalk, holding a bag of groceries. She had kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put him at ease. I'm Maria, she said, extending a hand. Jake, he replied, shaking it. Maria chuckled. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years, and I've seen people come and go. It's not easy being the new face, especially when you stand out. Jake sighed. That's putting it lightly. I feel like no one wants me here. Maria nodded knowingly. It's not personal, even if it feels that way. People here have been hurt, ignored, displaced, judged. Sometimes they see you, and you're a reminder of those things. That's not fair, Jake said, his frustration bubbling up. No, it's not, Maria agreed. But fairness doesn't always factor into people's pain. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Jake looked at her, unsure how to respond. Taking the first step. Maria's words stayed with Jake. A few days later, he decided to visit the community center to see how he could get involved. A flyer on the bulletin board advertised a need for volunteers to teach basic computer skills. Jake signed up, thinking it might be a way to show his neighbors he wasn't there to harm the community, but to contribute to it. On his first day, he was paired with an older man named Victor, who needed help setting up an email account. The interaction was awkward at first, but as Jake patiently guided Victor through the process, the man began to relax. By the end of the session, Victor smiled and said, "Thanks, kid. You've got a good way of explaining things." Those words buoyed Jake's spirits. Building connections. Week by week, Jake's presence at the community center became more familiar. He began to recognize faces and names, and the coldness he once felt started to thaw. One afternoon, Malik, the cashier from the corner store, showed up at the center for a computer class. Jake greeted him with a smile, and though Malik's initial reaction was guarded, the two eventually struck up a conversation. You're not as bad as I thought, Malik admitted with a smirk after class. Jake laughed. Thanks, I think. Facing challenges together. As Jake became more involved, he also started to see the deeper struggles his neighbors faced: displacement, systemic inequities, and cultural misunderstandings. He realized that while he had felt like an outsider, many of them had spent their entire lives fighting to be seen and heard. Jake attended another community meeting, this time prepared to listen more than speak. When the topic of housing came up again, Jake raised his hand. I know I'm new here, and I can't pretend to understand everything you've been through. But I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. Maybe we can work together to find ways to support the people who've been here longest. His words were met with cautious nods, and for the first time, Jake felt a glimmer of acceptance. Small victories. By the end of his first year in the neighborhood, Jake had become a familiar face. Neighbors who once avoided him now greeted him with nods or smiles. He was invited to a block party where he shared a laugh with Victor and played a game of dominoes with Malik. Though not everyone warmed to him, Jake had learned an important lesson. Belonging wasn't about being universally accepted. It was about building connections, one step at a time. As the seasons changed, so did Jake's place in the neighborhood. It was subtle at first. Neighbors who once ignored him began nodding and passing, and shopkeepers greeted him by name. Over time, the connections he worked to build became stronger. Malik, the once gruff cashier at the corner store, now laughed with Jake when he came in, joking about his preference for black coffee and bagels. Even Victor, his first student at the community center, had become a friend, often stopping by Jake's stoop to chat about local events. Jake felt the shift most profoundly during the neighborhood's summer block party. The event had always seemed closed off to him in the past, more of a gathering for longtime residents than newcomers like himself. But this year, as he walked down the street, he was greeted warmly. Maria waved him over to her table, where she had set up platters of homemade empanadas. Malik called out to Jake, inviting him to join a basketball game in the makeshift court set up in the parking lot. Sitting down to eat with Maria and a group of other neighbors, Jake listened to their stories, laughing at their jokes and learning about their lives. For the first time, he felt like he wasn't just living in the neighborhood. He was part of it. He realized that the walls he'd felt at first hadn't just been about others keeping him out. They had also been his own insecurities and assumptions. By stepping out of his comfort zone and engaging with those around him, he had found common ground in unexpected places. As the party wound down, Maria sat beside him and patted his shoulder. "You've done good, Jake," she said with a warm smile. "It's not easy being the new guy, but you stuck it out. That says something." Jake smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without people like you," he replied. "Thanks for helping me figure things out." Maria nodded. "We all need each other. That's what makes a community." As Jake walked home that evening, the streetlights casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, he reflected on how far he had come. The hurt and confusion he had felt in those early days hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been replaced by something stronger: understanding, respect, and a sense of belonging. He knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But he also knew he wasn't alone anymore, and that, more than anything, made it all worth it.